everyone, so here we are with chapter 5, 6 and 7 of the Ickabog to try and catch us up a little bit. You can probably hear the dogs moving around because they've decided it's their tea time. So let's get started. Chapter 5, Daisy Dovetail. For some months after Mrs. Dovetail's shocking death, the king's servants were divided into two groups. The first group whispered that King Fred had been to blame for the way she died. The second preferred to believe that there'd been some kind of mistake and that the king couldn't have known how ill Mrs. Dovetail was before giving her the order that she must finish his suit. Mrs. Beamish, the pastry serf, belonged to the second group. The king had always been very nice to Mrs. Beamish, sometimes even inviting her into the dining room to congratulate her on a particularly fine batch of Duke's delights or folderol fancies, so she was sure he was a kind, generous and considerate man. "You mark my words, somebody forgot to give the king a message," she told her husband, Major Beamish. "He'd never make an ill servant work. I know he must feel simply awful about what happened." "Yes," said Major Beamish, "I'm sure he does." Like his wife, Major Beamish wanted to think the best of the king, because he, his father, and his grandfather before him had all served loyally in the Royal Guard. So even though Major Beamish observed that King Fred seemed quite cheerful after Mrs. Dovetail's death, hunting as regularly as ever, and though Major Beamish knew that the Dovetails had been moved out of their old house to live down by the graveyard, he tried to believe that the king was sorry for what had happened to his seamstress, and that he'd had no hand in moving her husband and daughter. The Dovetails' new cottage was a gloomy place. Sunlight was blocked out by the high yew trees that bordered the graveyard, although Daisy's bedroom window gave her a clear view of her mother's grave, through a gap between dark branches. As she no longer lived next door to Bert, Daisy saw less of him in her free time, although Bert went to visit Daisy as often as possible. There was much less room to play in her new garden, but they adjusted their games to fit. What Mr. Dovetail thought about his new house, or the king, nobody knew. He never discussed those matters with fellow servants, but went quietly about his work, earning the money he needed to support his daughter, and raising Daisy as best he could without her mother. Daisy, who liked helping her father in his carpenter's workshop, had always been happiest in overalls. She was the kind of person who didn't mind getting dirty, and she wasn't very interested in clothes. Yet in the days following the funeral she wore a different dress every day to take a fresh posy to her mother's grave. While alive, Mrs. Dovetail had always tried to make her daughter look, as she put it, like a little lady, and had made her many beautiful little gowns, sometimes from the offcuts of material that King Fred graciously let her keep after she'd made his superb costumes. And so a week passed, and then a month, and then a year, until the dresses her mother had sewn her were all too small for Daisy, but she kept them carefully in her wardrobe. Other people seemed to have forgotten what had happened to Daisy, or had got used to the idea of her mother being gone. Daisy pretended that she was used to it too. On the surface, her life returned to something like normal. She helped her father in the workshop, did her schoolwork, and played with her best friend Bert, but they never spoke about her mother, and they never talked about the king. Every night Daisy lay with her eyes fixed on the distant white headstone shining in the moonlight until she fell asleep. Well, that's quite sad, so let's have a look at the next chapter and see what happens. Chapter 6, The Fight in the Courtyard. There was a courtyard behind the palace where peacocks walked, fountains played, and statues of former kings and queens kept watch. As long as they didn't pull the peacocks' tails, jump in the fountains, or climb the statues, the children of palace servants were allowed to play in the courtyard after school. Sometimes Lady Eslanda, who liked children, would come and make daisy chains with them. But the most exciting thing of all was when King Fred came onto the balcony and waved, which made all the children cheer, bow and curtsy as their parents had taught them. The only time the children fell silent, ceased their games of hopscotch, and stopped pretending to fight the ickabog was when Lords Spittleworth and Flapoon passed through the courtyard. These two lords weren't fond of children at all. They thought the little brats made far too much noise in the late afternoon, which was precisely the time when Spittleworth and Flapoon liked to take a nap between hunting and dinner. One day, shortly after Bert and Daisy's 7th birthdays, when everyone was playing as usual between the fountains and the peacocks, the daughter of the new head seamstress, who was wearing a beautiful dress of rose-pink brocade, said, "Oh, I do hope the king waves at us today." Well, I don't, said Daisy, who couldn't help herself and didn't realise how loudly she'd spoken. The children all gasped and turned to look at her. Daisy felt hot and cold at once, seeing them all glaring. You shouldn't have said that, whispered Bert, as he was standing right next to Daisy. The other children were staring at him too. I don't care, said Daisy, colour rising in her face. She'd started now, so she might as well finish. If he hadn't worked my mother so hard, she'd still be alive. Daisy felt as though she'd been wanting to say that out loud for a very long time. There was another gasp from all the surrounding children, and a maid's daughter actually squealed in terror. He's the best king of cornucopia we've ever had, said Bert, who'd heard his mother say so many times. No, he isn't, said Daisy loudly. He's selfish, vain, and cruel. Daisy, whispered Bert, horrified. Don't be silly. It was the word silly that did it. Silly, when the new head seamstress's daughter smirked and whispered behind her hands to her friends while pointing at Daisy's overalls. Silly, when her father wiped away his tears in the evenings thinking Daisy wasn't looking. Silly, when to talk to her mother she had to visit a cold white headstone. Daisy drew back her hand and smacked Bert right around the face. Then the oldest Roach brother, whose name was Roderick and who now lived in Daisy's old bedroom, shouted, Don't let her go away with it, Butterball, and led all the boys in shouts of fight, fight, fight. Terrified, Bert gave Daisy's shoulder a half-hearted shove, and it seemed to Daisy that the only thing to do was to launch herself at Bert, and everything became dust and elbows until suddenly the two children were pulled apart by Bert's father, Major Beamish, who'd come running out of the palace on hearing the commotion to find out what was going on. Dreadful behaviour, muttered Lord Spittleworth, walking past the Major and the two sobbing, struggling children. But as he turned away, a broad smirk spread over Lord Spittleworth's face. He was a man who knew how to turn a situation to good use, and he thought he might have found a way to banish children, or some of them anyway, from the palace courtyard. So, Chapter 7. Lord Spittleworth Tells Tales. That night the two lords dined, as usual, with King Fred. After a sumptuous meal of Baronstown venison, accompanied by the finest Jeroboam wine, followed by a selection of Kurtzberg cheeses and some of Mrs. Beamish's featherlight fairies' cradles, Lord Spittleworth decided the moment had come. He cleared his throat, then said, I do hope, Your Majesty, that you weren't disturbed by that disgusting fight among the children in the courtyard this afternoon. Fight? Repeated King Fred, who'd been talking to his tailor about the design for a new cloak, so had heard nothing. What fight? Oh dear, I thought Your Majesty knew, said Lord Spittleworth, pretending to be startled. Perhaps Major Beamish could tell you all about it. But King Fred was amused rather than disturbed. Oh, I believe scuffles among children are quite usual, Spittleworth. Spittleworth and Flippoon exchanged looks behind the king's back, and Spittleworth tried again. Your Majesty is, as ever, the very soul of kindness, said Spittleworth. Of course, some kings, Flippoon muttered, brushing crumbs off the front of his waistcoat, if they'd heard that a child had spoken of the crown so disrespectfully. What's that? exclaimed Fred, the smile fading from his face. A child spoke of me disrespectfully? Fred couldn't believe it. He was so used to children shrieking with excitement when he bowed to them from the balcony. I believe so, Your Majesty, said Spittleworth, examining his fingernails. But as I mentioned, it was Major Beamish who separated the children. He has all of the details. The candles sputtered a little in their silver sticks. Children say all manner of things in fun, said King Fred. Doubtless the child meant no harm. Sounded like bully treason to me, grunted Flippoon. But, said Spittleworth swiftly, it is Major Beamish who knows the details. Flippoon and I may perhaps have misheard. Fred sipped his wine. At that moment a footman entered the room to remove the pudding plates. Cankerby, said King Fred, for such was the footman's name. Fetch Major Beamish here. Unlike the king and the two lords, Major Beamish didn't eat 7 courses for dinner every night. He'd finished his supper hours ago and was getting ready for bed when the summons from the king arrived. The major hastily swapped his pyjamas for his uniform and dashed back to the palace, by which time King Fred, Lord Spittleworth and Lord Flippoon had retired to the yellow parlour, where they were sitting on satin armchairs drinking more Jeroboam wine and, in Flippoon's case, eating a second plate of fairies' cradles. "Ah, Beamish," said King Fred as the Major made a deep bow. "I hear there was a little commotion in the courtyard this afternoon." The Major's heart sank. He'd hoped the news of Bert and Daisy's fight wouldn't reach the King's ears. "Oh, it was really nothing, Your Majesty," said Beamish. Come, Beamish," said Flapoon. "You should be proud that you've taught your son not to tolerate traitors." There was no question of treachery," said Major Beamish. "They are only children, my lord." "Do I understand that your son defended me, Beamish?" said King Fred. Major Beamish was in a most unfortunate position. He didn't want to tell the King what Daisy had said. Whatever his own loyalty to the King, he quite understood why the motherless little girl felt the way she did about Fred, and the last thing he wanted to do was get her in trouble. At the same time, he was well aware that there were 20 witnesses who could tell the King exactly what Daisy had said, and was sure that if he lied, Lord Spittleworth and Lord Flapoon would tell the King that he, Major Beamish, was also disloyal and treacherous. Yes, Your Majesty, it's true that my son Bert defended you," said Major Beamish. "However, allowances must surely be made for the little girl who said the unfortunate thing about Your Majesty. She passed through a great deal of trouble, Your Majesty, and even unhappy grown-ups may talk wildly at times." "What kind of trouble has the little girl passed through?" asked King Fred, who couldn't imagine any good reason for a subject to speak rudely of him. Her name is Daisy Dovetail, Your Majesty," said Major Beamish, staring over King Fred's head at a picture of his father, King Richard the Righteous. "Her mother was the seamstress who—" Yes, I remember," said King Fred loudly, cutting Major Beamish off. "Very well, that's all, Beamish. Off you go." Somewhat relieved, Major Beamish bowed deeply again and had almost reached the door when he heard the King's voice. "What exactly did the girl say, Beamish?" Major Beamish paused with his hands on the doorknob. There was nothing else for it but to tell the truth. "She said Your Majesty is selfish, vain and cruel," said Major Beamish. Not daring to look at the King, he left the room. So we're starting to catch up now, so we're going to finish there. There's a true and false quiz for you on Purple Mash, so have a look at that. And then tomorrow we'll do some more reading to see if we can't catch up a little bit with the chapters that are being released each day.